So I was saying we lost Little Richard. So he was a gay black man from Macon, Georgia. Um, and he really started rock and roll. So he was one of the first 10 inductees in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And there were some interesting stories about him. We don't have time to cover all of them. So first, I want to call out a story about Schrodinger, an Austrian physicist. So he came up with this thought experiment where a cat in a box is both alive and dead at the same time. To poke holes in the theories of quantum mechanics that are above my head. But he offered up this idea in 1935. So you might think, what does that have to do with Little Richard and rock and roll? And it has everything to do with Little Richard and nothing. So at the same time, in 1935, there was a 2-year-old little boy living in the African-American Pleasant Hill neighborhood in Macon, Georgia. The third child of an eventual 12 siblings to a bricklaying Seventh-day Adventist church deacon father, a nightclub, and sold moonshine on the side, and a church-going mother. So this little boy, Richard Penniman, would grow up to be what many consider to be the architect of rock and roll. At 10 years old, Richard was performing faith healings while singing and preaching. By 13, he was kicked out of his house for being homosexual. In 1950, Richard was performing what his family would call the devil's music, and in drag no less, as Princess Lavon. I mentioned that he was gay, but he also had relationships with women, so really he was probably more bisexual. He referred to himself as omnisexual. By 1955, he had his first hit with Tutti Frutti, which was originally a risque song with references to gay sex, tweaked for broader appeal after the record company insisted, for some reason, that they take out all references to anal sex. So, Tutti Frutti, Good Booty became Tutti Frutti, All Rudy. This was followed in 1956 by Long Tall Sally, fusing country, blues, jazz, and boogie woogie, exciting performances and brought integrated audiences to segregated venues, causing white supremacist organizations to say rock and roll was dangerous, and it was bringing the races together. Little Richard said he got even more flamboyant on stage and wore makeup so people would not think that he was after the white girl. So a couple of years into this wild success in 1957, Little Richard was on a tour in Australia, no less, when a flight he was on that was heading to perform in Sydney had some troubles. And looking out the window, he saw the red hot engines out of the plane window and said he felt like angels were holding the plane up in the sky. And at the end of that show in Sydney, he looked up in the sky and saw a bright red fireball. It shook him, and he took a sign from God to repent and get right with God and decided to follow a life in ministry. That fireball was the Russian satellite Sputnik. Sputnik had killed rock and roll, but it also kept it alive at the same time. Little Richard had left his Australian tour flying home 10 days early after seeing Sputnik in the sky and thinking it was a sign from God. 10 days later, the original flight home he would have been on crashed into the Pacific Ocean. So heading in a new direction, Little Richard did a farewell performance at the Apollo Theater and a final recording session before enrolling in theology school. But what I found is, he said he found religion, but it might really have been economics. The record label wasn't really paying him fairly, so the rights to Tutti Frutti had been sold to the record company for $50. It's part of a racist system where black performers weren't paid equally or treated the same. Little Richard would travel the country preaching and recording gospel music, but in 1962, he was talking toward Europe again, which resulted in him changing direction and going back to playing his hits. The crowds went crazy. The Beatles and Rolling Stones even opened for him at some shows. By 1964, he was back on the scene, but it might have been too late with the fans' music taste shifting. By the 70s, he was addicted to drugs and alcohol. And in 1977, he quit rock and roll again to return to evangelism and gospel music. In the mid-80s, Richard sued the record company, re-embraced rock and roll, found success in collaborating with other artists, appearing in TV and film. He also officiated weddings for people like Bruce Willis and Tom Petty. He kept performing through the 90s and 2000s, retiring in 2013. So there's much more to Little Richard's story, but I'm coming up on 5 minutes. So we can certainly say that he changed direction throughout his life, more than a drag queen changes outfits. Even though the Russian space program slowed Little Richard's aspirations at the time, it saved him from permanent demise and gave us Schrodinger's Sputnik scenario, where rock and roll was both dead and alive at the same time. Thanks.
Good.